Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast with Hemma, Lomax, and me, Lisa Fine. We are sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights and the Compliance Podcast Network, and you can get great information in both those spots. When we talk about compliance programs, we talk about risk assessments, but in order to accurately assess risk for an organization, we need to understand the larger risk landscape. Today, Hemma has joined me, and we're talking with Jisha Dymond and Lisa Beth Lentini Walker to talk about risk assessments, and particularly in the cross-functional space. So thank you both so much for being here. And can we get a quick introduction to both of you? Let's start with you, Jisha.
Sure. I'm thrilled to be here. First, I have to say I've been listening to this podcast for a long time, so it's kind of surreal to be here. But I've held legal compliance risk roles across a mix of industries and company sizes, from fast-growing tech to complex global organizations. I've led programs in ethics, compliance, privacy, and sustainability. And usually I say my focus is to connect dots across functions and being practical and strategic. And most importantly, I bring the jokes and the fun because I think work should be fun. So that's me.
And Lisa Beth, you are no stranger to us, and particularly to me as being a mentor and friend, which we say often. But with that, can you talk about what you're doing right now, particularly how you've evolved from an ethics and compliance space to a more cross-functional role?
Absolutely. And I have to say, I am just so excited to be here with everyone today because not only is this a super cool topic, but I get to be around super cool leaders to talk about it who are all passionate about what we do in this space. So my background is I began in the securities law space, eventually evolving into compliance, ethics, corporate governance, and risk. And actually, all of the skills that I've learned along the way are things that I use every day. So today I run a global consulting firm in compliance, ethics, and corporate governance. And I'm also the Deputy General Counsel of a fintech based out of Oakland called Marqueta, where I am the Deputy General Counsel in charge of corporate legal. And I work with the board of directors as the assistant secretary to the board. So I like being able to talk about risk, not only from the management lens, but also from like, what are boards asking for? And what do boards want to see as we think about how we navigate all of the risks that exist every single day in our lives and the lives of the people that we work with and for, and also for the organizations that we are dedicated to.
Such a great segue into what my first question is going to be, given all of your experience in this area. You've talked about how you use them, but can you talk a little bit about using risk assessments strategically and holistic risk assessments? What is that exactly, and how is that similar to or differs from a traditional risk assessment in compliance?
So I think first, it's really important to understand what are the risks we're talking about. So when we look at business risks, we can kind of bucket them into a couple of major categories. There are financial risks to the business, strategic risks, operational risks, compliance risk, which is part of what we all love and we focus in on. So if you think about it in those kind of 5 basic categories, when we start doing things like risk assessments and talking about those holistic risk assessments, we should be thinking about the 5 buckets, not just the bucket that's in front of us, which is compliance, but how does it impact those other areas that might manifest into really significant risk? A lot of those compliance risks can carry significant financial risk. They can carry significant reputational risk, and a lot of times operational risk too. If you think about even cybersecurity, like all of those things can manifest in a cybersecurity risk, and being cognizant and calling those out, I think is really important to be able to have a risk assessment that actually addresses things beyond just, did you comply with this particular law? Did you comply with this particular policy? It goes beyond that to what are the impacts in the other areas of the business and how could this be felt?
Yeah, and I agree with Lisa Beth. I mean, I would say, when I think about strategic risk assessments, holistic risk assessments, I think, Hemma, you and I have talked about it previous in conferences about like strategic objectives of the company and the sort of risks that are presented for the company, right? Ultimately, I think the biggest sort of difference between a compliance risk assessment and a strategic or a holistic assessment is that the strategic and the holistic assessments shape the direction of the company. They have real power to shape the direction of the company. Whereas compliance assessments are really about regulatory and legal issues, right? And to Lisa Beth's points about the buckets of risk, right? But I think a really important question to say is like, what does compliance have to do with a strategic assessment or a holistic assessment? Or we could say holistic is ERM, enterprise risk assessment as well, right? We could say that's what it's about. What does compliance have to do that? I think that's a big challenge where you may, in your initial sort of foray into that, say, hey, stay in your lane. You're in compliance. You manage the compliance risks, right? What do you have to do with the strategic objectives of the company or, the ERM program or the enterprise risk levels, right? And I think that's an important part of this conversation is to say that holistic risk assessments and sort of strategic assessments are really about supporting growth, right? And operational efficiency and brand protection. Compliance assessments can do that depending on how wide, they are. But I think the conversation that you kind of have to have is really about what is the difference and what is the value those things bring versus a compliance assessment that really may be about, ensuring that you don't get on the regulator's radar. So I think there's big differences between the three and different goals for the three and different conversations that you have to have for all three to get the buy-in.
Emma, what about you?
Well, as you said, I love to talk about objective-centered risk management, so I agree with the comments that have been made here. And it doesn't surprise me that Lisa Beth, reports to or supports the board because often the board is thinking much more holistically than we might be. Jisha highlights a really interesting point that we sometimes see ourselves as separate. And maybe we are, or maybe we're not, but I think it's going to be devastating to our functions going forward if we continue to stay separate to the strategic objectives of the company. And so that's why we talk in terms of objective-centered risk management, even for compliance officers, because if you're not helping the company get where it wants to go, swiftly, strategically, and safely, then what are you doing, right? And that old hack about, oh, the regulators are coming for us is not going to be very persuasive when the company is moving in one direction as an engine. So we want to make sure that we don't, not to use the cliche, but I use it all the time. Don't start being the office of no because of this side regulator over here that might not be coming. Start thinking about how you're helping to unlock responsible growth with the other stakeholders. And that's kind of the thing I wanted to ask about, because even with just the bucket of compliance risk, we're not the only ones doing it in the company, right? There's a chief information security officer over here and a vendor security team over there, on and on and on, HR, ER, we're all doing some kind of compliance work. So my question to the ladies here was really, how do we do this? How do we bring these other functions who are working into risk management, often with their own processes or functions? How do we bring them into the conversation? How do you even identify those key stakeholders and then work with them well? Let's start with you, Jisha.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think stakeholders are going to vary by organization, but in most companies, they do have, like you said, Hemma, functions like in cybersecurity or audit, internal audit, right? HR, legal. These are all functions that theoretically are managing risk for the company. I find that InfoSec tends to be a really easy partner because they have to get their certifications and, NIST and, ISO certifications require certain risk management processes. So they're pretty easy. I find that dragging HR and literally it's dragging HR and legal into it, right? Like it's funny how legal is like such a huge risk management function, but doing actual risk assessments, in my experience, has been a little bit. They tend to be narrative summaries, and you're like, that's not risk assessment. And in some organizations, you may have functions like corporate security. When I worked at Twitter, corporate security was a huge part of our risk team because they were managing not just theoretical risk, but also physical risk, right? The security of our employees. We had a huge trust and safety organization that was managing risks of our users, right? So they are important stakeholders, and it really depends on your organization who are going to be key. But I think it also ultimately it depends on figuring out who has ownership over critical controls, critical data, critical processes, and whose input is necessary to get a complete view of that risk landscape, right? what are they actually looking at? What do they control? And how do we get them into this party, this conversation? I think there are going to be a lot of folks in my experience that want to be part of the risk conversation, but don't actually have any data or controls or anything. They're just kind of a bystander, which is fine. I'm okay with people who, come to the party without any drinks, but you really got to bring something if you want to be a important stakeholder into the conversation, so that when you get to the board or when you get to your executives, everyone is bringing something to that risk conversation. So I think ultimately it really depends on your company, how big it is, and who has access to controls and data and processes.
Lisa Beth, Jisha brings up a really good point about risk ownership and control ownership. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But how do you identify these key risk owners, and how do you bring them together?
Look, I think you do have to look at exactly what are you talking about and who does form a control function as part of that overall, or who should form a control function, whether they are actually doing it or not. That is how I start looking at these different parts and pieces. And I wish everybody wanted to be part of the risk conversation. I don't think that's a reality, at least for many of the places that I have worked. A lot of people hear risk and they're like, no, thank you. You can go and do your risk assessment and you can handle it, but I don't want to be part of it. That rigor, the findings, etc., really can throw people off. So it really is asking people to come in and be part of this solution and explaining the why for them in terms of how do they play a part that makes sense and how can it help them. So I am a perennial friend of the audit function, the internal audit function. I find our finance friends oftentimes will focus on financial, maybe not as much on some of the operational risks, but it's a great opportunity to educate them. And then I have found some of the same dynamics with and trying to make sure that they actually are participating and wanting to be part of this process. It's an opportunity for growth for everyone, but identifying those stakeholders by looking at those processes, I don't find that there's an abundance of them. There's not a bumper crop, at least, when I've looked at it, to have people say, like, let's do some of this heavy lifting on the assessment side. They'll participate, but not necessarily with as much passion and perseverance as one would hope, I think.
And you're making a really good point about that, all the some who are more or less interested. I think one of the critical parts for me too is we don't know what we don't know, and we can't accurately assess it. Now, it generally is, organization by organization, but if internal audit, internal controls are seeing something and they're seeing it as a high risk and you're seeing it as a lower one, you want to see why you think that and vice versa. And I think one of the, making sure you have the different geographies, not just main markets in your risk assessment. I think oftentimes for finance or for others, it's, where's the most money coming from, as you were saying, to make the most material risks. And for us to be able to incorporate in those thoughts of these may be smaller in terms of potential financial loss, but are much larger in terms of a compliance concern. So you've got to remember, like, this may be less likely, but much higher risk and needs to at least be regulated, checked. And I think that's a really important part of it all. But even having said that, with all of these groups, and when you have the ones that are participating, people can do different methodologies and how they're doing risk assessment. Or as I think of it, as we all have our own languages. It's not necessarily just what you speak at home versus work. It's what you speak as a compliance professional or finance or HR or pure legal. So how do you work with that and be able to coordinate and collaborate so you can get something common? And not just say, for my last point is, I don't think any of these are the functions that you think that are saying they're over budgeted. They're all doing less with more. So how do we build that common work? So Jisha, let me start with you on that one.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I want to go back to something you said, Lisa, about, compliance. This might be a bigger compliance risk, whereas the finance team may say this is something that presents significant financial risk. I think that if we think about risk in terms of impact and probability, though, right? Like financial risk is always a consideration, right? And so if you take a risk and you're saying you're objectively, looking at it, the loss of money, whether it's a revenue stream through some sort of operational issue, or if it's because of a fine, at the end of the day, it's still money, right? So like, I think there is a way to, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, say, hey, we can see this in the same lens, because at the end of the day, compliance risk includes loss of money, fines, et cetera. But going back to your point about coordinating common language and methodology, and I actually wrote an article recently in Corporate Compliance Insights on this, and sort of like, the point of it was like ERM can be massive, it can be a massive effort, and there's a sort of a middle of the road approach that I write in there. And it does start from that common language. When I got to a hedge fund, the InfoSec team was using 5x5 methodology for assessing risk. I traditionally used 4x4. I got there and said, I'll use 5x5 because that's easier. That's how we compare apples to apples. Like if you're saying, critical risk is defined by this, and I'm saying, high risk is defined by this, well, you get to the board and now it's like, it's impossible to have a conversation, right? So I think flexibility is good, but at the end of the day, it starts with trust. Collaboration requires building trust first, right? Once there's that sort of mutual trust and understanding that we're both experts here, but in little different ways, it becomes easier to sort of align on definitions and methodologies, and priorities. And that means clarifying what is the risk taxonomy, right? Like, let's write that down. At Twitter, we had a document that all the risk teams used that identified our risk definitions, had our matrices on what is high versus low risk, and how did we define all these things, right? We agreed on risk ratings and standardizing sort of formats so we could aggregate at the end of the day. And so it may sound basic to say that it starts with trust, but all collaboration starts with trust. Become BFF with your CISO, become BFF with your head of audit, or your head of corporate security, or whatever it is. Develop that relationship first, build the trust, and then start saying, hey, let's start working together. It's basic, but I think that's just how humans work.
Absolutely. And I also just wanted to mention, when I'm thinking about the difference in function or materiality, it's just sometimes we talk about dollar value of one versus the other, speculative versus reality. And what you're saying really does, hit home, because it's the same when it happens. And similarly, I think, again, and we'll turn over to Lisa Beth in a second too, I also think the trust relationship is a component of every single thing of what we do, because if you've made sure you actually understand or speak with people, this is kind of my common theme about almost anything, is get to know these people before you suddenly tell them we want to collaborate on a risk assessment, when they'll say, and you are? Thanks for dropping by. So I completely think that that's a lesson that can be taken for risk assessments and pretty much anything people do. So if you're going to succeed. Now, Lisa Beth, with that, what about you?
So let me just call out for a second. I love what Jisha said, because ultimately all of this ends up at some point rolling up to the board. And the last thing the board wants to see is you using, a 5-step versus 4-step. That is confusing. So when we think about the ultimate audience, which may be a regulator or it may be your board of directors, you need to be using this common taxonomy and common methodology. So you're comparing apples to apples. Because if you're using different language and you're classifying things in completely different ways, you can't understand the whatever the risk assessment is in context. Like a lot of times, I think beyond just the communication, the alignments of methodologies, having some form of, visual aids, using data as much as possible, right? Some of our risk assessments, you have to look at facts and circumstances, but the more that you can have data-driven decisioning, data-driven information, the more validity, the more credibility there is in any conversation. Because what we know about how people learn is that some people are highly visual learners. Some people will focus only on the data and they won't focus on the narrative. Other people will focus much more on the narrative and less on the data. So what you're trying to do is be able to communicate in ways that many audiences will grab onto and bring into their own understanding. And then that consistency in communication throughout the process is hypercritical, both so you're bringing people along in the process and then what's to come next. Because once you have a risk assessment, that's not the end of the story. That's just the beginning of the story. We've got lots of chapters behind that in terms of reporting and remediation and a whole host of other things that we all need to work on and collaborate on together. So you don't want to have that misstep at the very beginning when you are aligning how you talk about risk, the language that you use regularly. And a lot of people will say, no, you can never say material unless it meets a materiality threshold, which is defined by the SEC or whatever your regulator is. You should know what those kind of pitfalls are and landmines. And then you should be able to, move forward in a way that is going to make a lot of sense and yield the results that you want and less of the stuff that you don't, which is the baggage that comes with lack of alignment from the beginning.
Hemma.
No, I certainly agree with both points. Just again, I want to underscore what you said. Look, playing nice in terms of not insisting on your methodology or your scoring framework is very smart. I will say, though, I'm going to be a bit provocative here. We want to be kind, not nice, right? So that's not to say that you're always right, but there is probably the best or better way to do things. And I think it's part of that trust building that you mentioned, Jisha, I think is being able to speak up and say, well, look, is this actually helpful? And I like to say the hashtag so what? I'm also going to be provocative to you, Lisa, because you're right. We do need to think about the full journey. The risk assessment is the beginning. I wouldn't say the ultimate audience is the board or the regulator. I would say the ultimate audience there might be another one, right? Yes, and first, who's responding to your risk assessment questionnaire? So just that conversation, that language, your business. Let's just pick the regional sales leader in EMEA, for example, who will take the questionnaire or the interview from all the risk owners and do all the risk assessments. They need to be able to learn through that process how to identify and assess risk in real time, honestly, because we all know that the business is moving daily and our risk assessments might be moving a bit more slowly, a bit more annually, number one. And then secondly, is the output giving us decision useful information? Is anyone able, and you mentioned this, Lisa, is anyone able to make a decision based on the output of this risk assessment? Is that helpful? The other thing in terms of common language that I've definitely got stumped over is how do we even talk about first line, second line, third line, back to the who does what thing. So there's a little bit of that going on too in terms of it's a big process to get that nice traffic lighted or 5-box, 4-box, whatever it might be. But again, hashtag so what? What are we doing with that information? How does it actually translate back into the objectives and strategy of the company? So lots to think about there. But I do love the kind of nice and kind, right? Like make sure you're aligning with it's not just about my box versus your box. I love that point. And I do think we have to think about the end user, but let's make sure we're thinking about all of the end users, because in the end, the board isn't going to do very much with this information, right? After a few hours of audit committee or board, they're just going to either pat you on the back or tell you what they're worried about. The regulator, you really want to see them, but the person you really should be serving is the business. So no, I love that. Back over to you, Lisa.
Yeah, I mean, I also do think that with the board, suddenly when they get in trouble, that risk assessment becomes one of the highlights of their world. Like, did we know? Did we identify? Did you do that? So I think, it is, like you said, the nice versus kind. I personally like the approach of that. Whenever I'm not so nice or kind about something, after I've known people for long enough, they assume it's a very large problem, because I try to have that be of such a rare thing that if I think it's bad, they think it might be really bad. But some days it works better than others. Now, with that, we've now come up with the greatest risk assessment ever that's addressed everything that we've all talked about, and it's done. So we finished it. What's next? Recommendations on mitigating or accepting risk? What risks to address and when? Who's accountable for either actioning it or, in the alternative, saying this is not as large of a risk as you think? So let's just talk a little bit about this and your experiences with that. And Jisha, let's start with you for that one.
Sure. And I think highlighting Hemma's point here that like the key here is to translate it into a decision point, not a discussion point, right? Like we've had plenty of discussions around the risk. We present the heat wave and it's like, or the heat map, and it's like, now what, right? I will respectfully disagree with you a little bit, Hemma. I think the ultimate audience is the board and the executive team because they've got the money. And at the end of the day, if you need to mitigate risk, you got to pay for it, right? I agree with you, however, that the risk assessment process is an educational process that's really important, that those interviews are crucial to get people thinking about, like, what am I not thinking about, you know? And I absolutely agree with you. That process itself is educational and really important. But at the end of the day, you know, I think the most useless risk assessments are the ones where a CCO or whomever comes into, they get the half an hour, right? Because it's always running short. You get half an hour and you're presenting to people that are not that familiar with compliance. And, you know, you say, here's my, you know, heat map and here are the top 10 risks. And now they're like, okay, what do you want us to do about it? And that's the sort of key. And I think really it's so important to have a conversation around these sort of impact and talking about, you know, going back to our original point about this is really about operational efficiency and brand protection. It's not necessarily about compliance risk. It's talking about like what happens if this risk materializes, right? And backing that by real world examples. Here's the chain of events that happens if this risk that we think is very likely and very material happens, and make it tangible, make it relevant, and then say, okay, we think the recommendation is to accept the risk or to mitigate the risk or to compensate for this, whatever your terminology is, and the specific things that need to get done in order to do that, right? I think one of the things that's really hard for people in our profession is to understand that you have to accept a lot of risk. You have to tolerate a lot of risk. You may have, I don't know, 100 risks in your risk register. The only ones you care about are those 3 or 4 on the top. All the ones on the bottom, you're just going to put that in the thing and go to sleep and sleep fine, right? And so I think really being practical about, okay, we have this incredible risk around data protection because our asset management controls are terrible. This is the investment that we need to make to improve our asset management controls. Here's what we need to do exactly, and here's who we think we should do it, and here's how to fund it, right? Like that's really where you get to that next step of becoming a valuable partner and strategic advisor and get invited to the next conversation.
I love all of what you said. And when I look at this, I really think this is part of the battle for finite resources. How are we going to spend our time and energy in this organization? Because there are only so many hours in the day. And frankly, budgets are constrained everywhere. I've never gone someplace where there wasn't some limit on the budget. And so trying to understand how we allocate those resources and use them wisely in the furtherance of those larger objectives, that's the dialogue we always have to be having. But what the risk assessment process does is it bubbles this up into very tangible facts and points that you can utilize to have a better conversation about resource allocation. And, you know, especially during this time of year, because typically the fall is budgeting season, it's good to be talking about how does that risk assessment allow you to either accept the risk and understand what that truly means in all of its facets, allocate time, money, people, whatever it is, to address something to get to an improved state or improved revenue, more secure revenue, whatever it is. That's what all of this does. Now, the afterwards and how that's decided, that should all be aligned to what your findings are and where this maps out in terms of the things that you're willing to live with and the things that you're willing to accept in your organization.
I love that, and I couldn't agree more. And you know, I think you've both highlighted, it's strategy, isn't it? It's not only what you will be doing and what you'll be accepting; it's what you'll stop doing. Because if the resources are flat, you're going to have to do that work as well and explain what you're going to stop doing to start doing something else. Brilliant. Well, I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned a bit earlier, Lisa Beth, about data-informed risk assessments. So this is, you know, we've been hearing for decades now that we should be using data, we should be using data, we should be using data analytics. I'd love to hear from you let's a bit more of the how of how we use data and risk assessments and what your advice would be there for our listeners. Let's start with you, Lisa Beth.
Yeah. So, one of the wonderful things right now between all of the innovations is we have AI coming on the scene. We have a whole host of ways to far more efficiently crunch numbers and information. Now, sometimes in these risk assessments, the data can be hard to come by. And that's something that all organizations struggle with. But one of the things that I'm starting to do more of is utilize artificial intelligence to do some basic analytics to start with. And I have a love-hate relationship going on right now with artificial intelligence. I love that it exists. I don't always love what it comes up with because it's like it can be like a really bad intern. Like the instructions that you give are sometimes not the best, and then you end up with not the best results. And even if you give great instructions, you still can end up with not the best results. But to me personally, the more that you tie whatever you're looking at to facts and figures, the higher the likelihood that the data is actually driving the conversation, and that you will get A, resource allocation, and B, your results will have credibility. So I always look for the numbers wherever we can find them. Now, in some areas like investigations, yeah, you'll have the number of investigations that you had. You may have some data around like what was substantiated, what wasn't substantiated, how much time it took. But there may not be as many numbers as you would like to see, certainly not as many numbers as you would expect from a finance-driven risk assessment. I think you have to do the best you can with the information you have. And if you don't have processes to gather data, that can actually be a finding. And that can be something that you address so that the next risk assessment that you have is actually more data driven each time. So depending on what you're looking at, you may have paucity of data, or you may be having a bumper crop. If there is a gap, then that's something that you can address as part of this risk assessment process so that the next time it gets easier and easier.
No, and you make a good point about the intern, the AI intern. I also think of AI as the mirror. It tells us how bad our data is, or how scarce it is. One thing that keeps me up, Jisha, is data quality and data integrity in this day and age. So piggybacking a little bit on what Lisa Beth said, let me ask you your advice for our listeners on how can they ensure they are measuring the right thing, right? What gets measured gets done, collecting the right data, and then asking the right questions of the data to help with a risk assessment.
Yeah, no, it's such a massive topic. I mean, this is a podcast on its own, right, in terms of accuracy of data. But I always there's a fantastic book by an author called Daniel Kahneman. I'm sure everybody's heard of Thinking Fast and Slow, right? And to me, it's like a crucial risk management book, because at the end of the day, good risk management means slowing down enough to challenge our own instincts, right? There's a lot of bias in how we've traditionally done risk assessments, and moving from, sort of that intuitive decision to a deliberate evidence-based one, right? And he talks about how there's two systems of thinking. If I can summarize really quick, system one is like our fast, our intuition, our automatic, right? While system two is we slow down, we're analytical, we're deliberate. And in risk management, if you only rely on that sort of system one, where you ask somebody, hey, what keeps you up at night? They're going to tell you the thing that they experienced last week. They are not being analytical, right? So like, that recency bias. I mean, there's a million biases. I have actually a document next to my desk that I like just keep posted there that lists all these. But like that discipline of engaging in system two and asking deeper questions and validating assumptions and slowing that process so that we can eliminate bias and lead to better defensible, sort of risk decisions, that's so key. And that's what really what the data brings to you, right? That objectivity. And this can be qualitative or it can be quantitative, right? Yes, it includes the number of investigations, but also the outcomes and whether they were really important investigations or really dumb ones where somebody's complaining about their manager because they're pissed, right? control testing results, incident trends, sharing the metrics across the team. I always talk about how DSARs are not just a huge metric for privacy teams, but they're also a metric for compliance teams, because they really can give you an indicator of employee sentiment, right? If your employees are requesting DSARs, you got a problem. And so what are those shared metrics that we can, to our point of collaboration and cross-functionality with other teams, that can give us, sort of that important information. And the last thing I'll say is, in order for you to really use data well, you have to have a baseline, and then you have to be able to identify the anomaly. So just getting data that is kind of random isn't going to help. You have to really think about, okay, what is our baseline? What is normal for this company? And then when this data is showing that there's an anomaly, now we have to have a conversation, right? And that requires a lot of investment. It requires, to the point of, there's reams of data all across your company. Let's be real, right? We always say all companies are data companies now. It's a question of, how do you get access to it? How do you get it into a format that you can make a big batch and then identify the anomalies? This is a topic that can go forever.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah, there's so much.
I agree so much. And at the end of the day, I think it's really important as we navigate this. Jisha is right on. Our brains are wired for routine. And so anything that breaks that routine is instantly a threat. So we're trying to get people to kind of calm down the limbic system so that we are thinking rather than just doing. And a lot of times, if you depersonalize and de-emotionalize the situation, that's what's needed so that we can start taking off those blinders of instantaneous reactivity and getting to a more holistic, thoughtful solution, because we're using our thinking brains rather than our reacting brains. And the reality is, with the myriad of decisions we're making every day, everything from, should I take a sip of water now? Should I, go for a walk? How do I move this way? How am I being perceived? Am I looking at myself while I'm talking on the Zoom? There's a million things that are going through our brain each day. Every single moment, we are making so many complex decisions. Our brain wants things to be automated as much as possible because that makes life easier. And that includes at work. It's way easier to go through the routines that you already know than to do the daring thing and find a different path, because it may be a better path. It may be a faster path. It may be a safer. All of this is taking those data points, allowing us to have really good conversations, de-escalating and de-emotionalizing the facts so that we can get to better outcomes. And that's where the magic of what we do lies. It's not in even doing the risk assessment, which you have to be really good to do it. It's taking that and creating actionable data points that people can buy into. And that's something that can't be replicated by artificial intelligence.
Well, that's perfect timing for 2 points. The first one I'll say is, as we talk about that and the level, everyone's talking about different levels of sophistication in data, where you are and where your organization may be, it doesn't all have to be this amazing, it looks like it came out of some movie, or, with all these things. You can use what you have in different ways and continue to grow on it. And thinking about what you need, as opposed to saying this is all the bells and whistles, is also an important thing, depending on where you are. And one of my favorite overused phrases, fit for purpose, with that. And Lisa Beth, I swear you just walked me into what I think is the last thing I wanted to mention to both of you. Again, you've now talked about your complicated relationship with AI, which many of us are having these days. Is there a role for AI of some sort in risk management, and where do you think it would work? Or put more simply, where can we make the bad intern good and help make the rest of it easier? And is it possible? So, Lisa Beth, we'll start with you on that one.
So I think the answer to the question, the basic answer is yes, there could be a role for AI. I think that as we continue to learn more and work with data sets, this summer, the organization I'm working with, we have the Summer of AI, where we're learning about all different things, everything from like, how can it create better reports? How can it look for the tone that we're trying to seek in the different documents that we're creating? Now, you have to be very responsible about how you're doing this, because you may not want this to be part of a training set anywhere. And so you need to work with people who are really good at this stuff, including your information security team, to have approved methods and approved tools, and also do it in a segregated set so that you're not creating other artifacts that might not be helpful. But I think, of course, there is an opportunity to learn and do better and to be better, whether it's creating a different in your document, or asking for, where have I missed something, to see what the AI might bring in to find your own blinders or missed opportunities. So the way that you query and use this can actually lead you to have a better product. Now, I don't think it does it on its own. It does create some things, but we need thinking minds behind So that's where I think we're going to provide a lot of value going forward, in addition to being that bridge, that connector of dots that Jisha is so good at, as part of our winning combination for why we are important resources in this whole new world.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm a little bit more enthusiastic about the use of AI in risk management. I mean, I agree. I have a pit in my stomach, particularly when I hear things about like agentic AI and the idea that you can replace a compliance officer with agentic AI. But the reality is that is what's coming, and we're going to have to be thinking about, okay, well, how do I manage that risk, right? So there's the risk of managing AI, but then, you know, using AI in risk management, right? I think that when we talk about data, we just spoke about data and being able to spot patterns and anomalies. Well, if you have a huge data set, guarantee humans are going to miss some of those, and you can use an AI to detect those, right? I frankly think if you're a global multinational company and you're the CCO of it, you have massive amounts of data and you're not using AI for your risk management, I think you're fooling yourself a little bit, to be honest. I'm not trying to be judgy, but like, I think that's just reality. Yes, AI is going to bring new risks like the bias in the algorithms and opaque decision making and all of that. But I think that the most kind of effective programs are going to have to use that. And we're, you know, I think we're almost to the point where we're not just talking about AI, we're now getting to that next section, as I said, of AI agents, where they are pulling data from multiple systems in real time and connecting patterns that we're not going to be able to see. And, you know, even be able to run simulations to test scenarios and speed up all of that. I think Matt Kelly had a great article. A lot of people have been thinking about the sort of downfall of the 3 lines of defense. You don't need them. That's starting to look a little analog, right? When you have AI in this context, and that's the reality. And I think there's still a lot of teams who are, you know, got the pit in their stomach and that's pulling them back. But we've seen major technologies. We've gotten through them by kind of embracing them and managing the risk on them. And so I'm a little, I'm like, bring it in.
I'm with you, Jisha. I keep saying, quoting Hamilton, how lucky we are to be alive right now, right? And I love the theme of this. This has been such a treat, this podcast with you both, and with you, Lisa, that this idea that we can bring our brains back into the equation now, right? Really, this is the moment in time for the unleashing of human potential in the way you've both described, bringing our thinking brains in. Why? Because the tooling will catch up and do the things that we've been struggling to do all along, right? And like you said, we're all sitting on masses of decision, useful information, trapped in our data, trapped in our assessments, trapped in our traffic light pictures that we can now unpack. So no, this has been a real, like I said, a real treat. Thank you both for joining us. Thank you, Lisa, for getting this powerhouse together. I know our listeners will have benefited from this. You were right, Jisha. This could be 10 different podcasts of the coverage we did today. But I'm excited about the way that risk assessments can be used. I'm excited about AI-driven data analytics. Lisa, I'm glad that you flagged that for us. And yeah, lots more to come, as you say, Jisha. It's coming for us whether we like it or not. So with that, thank you for joining us. And please subscribe on the YouTube channel. And we always appreciate you, our listeners. Thank you, Lisa.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.